It's great to welcome back to the program today Andrew Seidel, who's a civil rights and constitutional attorney with the Freedom from Religion Foundation, where he serves as the director of strategic response, works to keep state and church separate. His new book is The Founding Myth: Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. Andrew, so great to have you back on.
Thank you for having me on. It really is a pleasure. I appreciate it, David.
So we recently did a story which was called something like The Founding Fathers Were Progressive and You Should Be Too. And
Yeah.
without getting into the sort of politics of it, there is this idea, which was part of that story, that we did our best to debunk, which is the idea that because all of the Founding Fathers were Christian, that there is either some explicit or implicit reasoning behind saying the United States is fundamentally a Christian nation. Now, before we get to part two of that, the first question we have to ask is, were the Founding Fathers actually Christian? What we found is that while they were mostly deists, they were not actually mostly Christian, as is often described. But my question to you is, does that even really matter in figuring out whether the United States should have this sort of motto or umbrella term of being a Christian nation? Is the religion of the Founding Fathers even relevant to that?
My contention is that it is not. And this is the argument that I try to make in The Founding Myth. It's a really interesting conversation, and it's fascinating to delve into the beliefs of the founders. But when you're talking about, well, is this actually a Christian nation? It doesn't matter. Let's just agree for a second, for the sake of argument, that all the founders were these Bible-believing, Jesus rose from the dead Christians. You would still then have to connect those beliefs to the founding of the United States. And just because somebody is religious, their religion doesn't claim ownership over every other idea that their mind generates. For instance, blue jeans were invented by two Jewish guys, but we don't go around calling them Jewish blue jeans. They're just blue jeans.
Well, you should see some of the YouTube comments I get before you say nobody's doing that. But yeah, I know we shouldn't be doing that.
Yeah, and I don't think we can judge everything by the YouTube comments, because they do.
Yes.
It degenerates quick down there. Sorry, everybody. But the larger point, I think, is you would still have to connect it to the founding, and you can't do that. And when you look at what the founders talked about and believed and actually wrote into the founding documents, they really did believe in the separation of state and church. They were trying to keep religion out of government and government out of religion. And that was kind of one of the big ideas that was unique to America. It was the first time that had been put into practice. And it was, it's the American invention, and it's probably our biggest contribution to political science. And we ought to be proud of that fact as Americans, proud of the separation of state and church, proud of its progressive leanings, I think, as well.
So if indeed the original founders did not have this belief of sort of Christian nationalism as the basis for the United States of America, and now there is a wing of the American political sphere that does have that belief, at some point something made that belief start among a certain wing of the American political sphere. Where did that start? Where did it come from? Where did this idea, this talking point that became very prevalent in certain political circles start from, if not with the actual founders?
And that's a fascinating question. So Christian nationalism is really this idea that the United States not only was founded as a Christian nation, but it was founded on Judeo-Christian principles.
Yeah.
But the coda to that is that it needs to return to those principles. So really, and that's the driving, motivating force for Christian nationalists. They're trying to get this return, and it's golden age thinking, really, except that the problem for them is that we never were founded as a Christian nation. So you saw it really the rise of Christian nationalism began with sort of the rise of the moral majority, and it didn't really get that name, Christian nationalism, until the mid-2000s. And it was always sort of this impotent little sideshow on the fringes of conservative politics, on the fringes of conservative religion. But that all changed with the 2016 election because Donald Trump rode a wave of Christian nationalism into the highest office in the land. I mean, he is not president in spite of his Christian nationalist leanings and rhetoric, but because of that Christian nationalist rhetoric.
Yeah, and that gets us to making this distinction, which is an important one, between between Christianity, so to speak, and Christian nationalism, because I think, as many have obviously pointed out, if you compare Donald Trump's philosophy and the way he's lived his life to the sort of Christian Bible, you see a lot of contradictions there. You see a lot of problems. But ultimately, most evangelical Christians did vote for Donald Trump. And it seems to me, Andrew, and correct me if I'm wrong, that underlying it is that even though Donald Trump may not have personally lived his life as a Christian, the nationalistic undertones of Donald Trump's campaign are in line with this broader idea of Christian nationalism that seems to be kind of separate from one identifying as a Baptist or as an evangelical, for example.
No, and that's absolutely right. And it's really important that people understand that. The number one predictor of whether or not somebody would vote for Donald Trump in the 2016 election was not political party, and it was not their religion. It wasn't even whether or not they were racist, socioeconomic status, none of that. The number one predictor was whether or not somebody believed that the United States was a Christian nation. So Christian nationalism was the best indicator of whether or not somebody would have been a Donald Trump voter in the 2016 election. That data is pretty ironclad now. Andrew Whitehead out of the University of Clemson has done a number of studies on this. It's very clear. So Trump wasn't tapping into even the Republican Party or even into the evangelical movement. There's just happens to be a huge overlap between those two and Christian nationalism. That was really what he was tapping into to win this election.
What about this a little more amorphous idea of you alluded to it already, Judeo-Christian values, which is we can slice and dice the exact religions of the founders. We can talk about separation of church and state in some kind of formal or legal sense, but it's undeniable, some will say, that the sort of fundamental moral infrastructure of the United States was based on the Judeo-Christian, and really to that means Christian because there were almost no Jews who were part of this group, mostly Christian people, Christian in terms of the values, again, not in terms of necessarily identifying as Baptist or whatever the case may be, who said, we want to leave England and settle the New World in order to have full religious freedom. How do we take on that argument, which is a little bit more nebulous and blurry?
And that's exactly what I try to do in the founding myth. And it is more nebulous and blurry, and that's why it's the fallback position. If you can push back on we're not founded as a Christian nation, the next argument you always get is, well, I really meant we were founded on Judeo-Christian principles. And that's really what the founding myth pushes back on. And so what I did was I actually compared the Judeo-Christian principles from the Bible. I looked at every one of the 10 commandments, and then I compared those to the founding principles of the United States, to those elements of political science and political philosophy that the founders used to actually build this country. And what I discovered was not just that Judeo-Christian principles didn't influence the founding, but that they're fundamentally opposed to the founding of the United States.
What's an example? Give like one or two examples of that if you can.
I mean, the best example would be, let's just focus on the first commandment. Right? The first commandment is, I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. It runs completely counter to one of our founding principles, religious liberty. You can worship no God. You can worship 100 gods. You get to have free religious liberty in this country. And if you were to follow the 10 commandments, you only get to worship that biblical God, and that's it. So there's this fundamental conflict. So it's not only that we weren't founded on Judeo-Christian values or principles, but it's a good thing we weren't. Otherwise, we wouldn't have the values and the freedoms that we so cherish today.
So if we decided to cherry pick only the areas in which maybe there does seem to be significant overlap between the sort of founding values and Christianity, just as a thought experiment for a second, we then get to the problem of sort of correlation and causation. And I've actually heard a number of thinkers point out that just because most of the individuals who made big advancements in, for example, stone tools, metal tools, maybe is a better example, were adherents to a certain religion, that doesn't really give us any causal case for the religion being a factor. It may just be that at the time there was a sort of default to a particular religious belief, so to speak. A lot of the values that do seem to overlap between the founders of the U.S. and Christianity are values that existed much more than 5,000 years ago in human societies anyway. So then the question is, are they really even Christian values?
And that's a really excellent point, and it is one that I do make in the founding myth in a couple different places. One thing that we often hear is, well, the United States was founded on the Golden Rule. And I think that's a hard argument to make, actually, but I just assume, for the sake of argument in the book, that is true. But then the next question is, well, is the Golden Rule really a Christian principle? And my argument is that it's not. This is a universal human principle that every successful society we know of has developed on its own. I mean, a 2, 3, 4-year-old child can understand the idea of reciprocal morality. It's really not a difficult concept. And to allow Christianity or even Christian nationalism to claim it as its own is to me a form of arrogance that I don't think we should allow to stand.
Can you talk a little bit about slogans like "In God We Trust" on money, or "One Nation Under God," or the addition of a reference to God in the Pledge of Allegiance, and the role that those slogans have in perpetuating these ideas of the United States as a Christian nation?
I mean, they have a huge role in perpetuating that myth, and the role is deliberate. So, one thing that I think maybe our side is pretty good at when it comes to pushing back on those mottos is pointing out that none of those are from the founding generation. But then we tend to leave it at that. And in the founding myth, I really wanted to go beyond that. So I explore how these phrases entered our vernacular. And it turns out that they were deliberately put there during times of national fear and strife, when you had a handful in each case, Christians, Christian nationalists we would call them today, trying to use their public office to promote their personal religion. So you have this happening during the height of the Civil War, when the country's literally tearing itself apart and people aren't paying attention to what's being inscribed on the coinage. And you had basically 3 guys responsible for getting it on there at that point. The same thing was happening in the 1950s, where we ended up with the National Day of Prayer and Under God and the Pledge. That it was this time of national fear. And so it's not just that they're taking advantage of a country that's scared and fearful, but they're also wiping out unifying sentiments with religion, which tends to be really divisive. And so our original de facto motto was "E pluribus unum," from one people, or from many people, one nation, from many states, one country. And they wiped that out with "In God We Trust." And the same thing happened with the Pledge of Allegiance. It used to read "One nation indivisible," which is this beautiful sentiment. And then they're literally dividing the indivisible with God. So it's not just they're taking advantage of times of fear and strife, and then they're wiping out unifying sentiments to promote their personal religion.
This all seems way bigger to me than partisan politics, in the sense that, okay, I mean, there are candidates whose philosophy is more of a departure from the sort of thinking that gets you to Christian nationalism. So there are differences. I'm not pretending that Trump and Biden and Bernie are all sort of like the same on this. But in a sense, this is a much bigger cultural thing. This relates to the courts and the Supreme Court in ways that kind of transcend many decades. So how does something like this change in a country when who we elect is only like a small piece of it?
I mean, you're absolutely right. And right now, it's infecting all kinds of policy. Immigration policy, we saw it in the Muslim ban. Education policy, Betsy DeVos is essentially trying to dismantle public education. All of those are on the back of Christian nationalism. Our foreign policy, we're seeing, and you are right that courts, judges, and not just Trump judges, are deciding cases based on some of the myths and the lies that I try to expose in my book. But you're also right to say that it's bigger. Because at its most basic level, what this is an attempt to redefine what it is to be an American. They are trying to say that to be an American, you have to be a Christian, and to be a Christian is to be an American. And once they've redefined the American identity like that, they're going to redefine all of our laws accordingly. And to me, that is one of the central reasons why I say that Christian nationalism is un-American. It's not just that those Judeo-Christian principles often are directly opposed to our founding values. It's that this entire movement is meant to redefine what it is to be an American in an un-American way.
We've been talking a lot about the content of Andrew Seidel's new book, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American, but there's much more great stuff in it. Andrew, always great to talk to you, and I really appreciate your time.
David, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure.